Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 14 in the book of 1 Peter. Today's title is Listen If You Suffer. And we're going to ask today, what can suffering do for me? Because suffering is an invitation, and it's all about how we respond to that invitation. All right, so we're in a section here in 1 Peter chapter 2, and he talked previous days about being subject to every human institution, and then he mentions the emperor. Honor the emperor. Oh my goodness, terrible human being, representative of a terrible government. And then he says, servants, be subject to your masters with respect, not only to the good and the gentle ones, but to the unjust. So we have unjust government, we have unjust bosses, and today we're going to find out that this section is not pro-subjugation, it's not pro-evil, it's not pro-slavery, and it's not pro-unjustness. What it is, it's pro-Jesus. And in a sense, it's kind of pro-suffering, which sounds crazy, if you do the right thing, because it's an invitation. So here we go. This is from 1 Peter chapter 2. For this is a gracious thing. This is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. And then he's going to talk the next verse about suffering justly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. All right, there's all kinds of things in here, and I know I'm talking this morning to a group of people who suffer. You suffer, I know it. So the first thing, let's just dispense with this right away, is that just suffering does exist. And that's where you get what's coming to you. Either here in the example is you sin and are beaten for it, or maybe something in our penal system, or maybe you're in a relationship right now where you shouldn't have been in the first place, and you're suffering relationally currently, and so basically it's just suffering. Number two is that unjust suffering does exist. Here's a person who does good and suffers for it. In fact, let's just call unjust suffering for the rest of this podcast and the rest of this little series. Let's just call unjust suffering, and shorten the title. All right, number three, suffering is not fun. It says here in verse 19, there's going to be some enduring and that it's going to be sorrowful. So this section of Scripture is not going to be pleasant. It's not going to be pleasing. It's not going to be satisfying. It's not going to be short-lived. It's not going to go away unless we respond well to the invitation that suffering leaves for us. Number four, unjust suffering can be a gracious thing. That this is where Scripture turns everything upside down. Unjust suffering can be a gracious thing. I'm saying that suffering can be a beautiful thing. It can be the place where you can be the center of God's favor, his kindness, his graciousness, and his care. That's what the word means. That's what this gracious things mean. Suffering can be a beautiful thing if you do it with the help of God. So suffering might be the place. Therefore, suffering is where you may meet the goodness of God. And if you want to see the goodness of God, if you want to see him better, it might be through suffering. All right, number five, suffering has the possibility, the chance, the opportunity to point you towards Jesus, to be led by Jesus, and to be seen by Jesus. It's a possibility. It's not a guarantee. Number six, suffering will never work. Here's where the guarantee comes. Suffering will never work if you are not mindful of God. That's what the passage says. For it's a gracious thing. It's a beautiful thing. It can be a place where you meet God when you're mindful of God. Your mind is full of him. That is, you have an awareness, a sensitivity that God is here. He's in this, and he sees me. So suffering can be a gracious and a good thing only, or best, if one has a mindful of God. So mindful means that there's this knowledge shared with another. And if you suffer alone, if you suffer without God, that's not what we're talking about. So suffering will never work unless you're mindful of God, or never work appropriately. So here's the picture for today, is you over on the left-hand side and God over on the right-hand side. And there's a connection between you, and it's a two-way street. One arrow goes from you to God, the other arrow goes from God to you. The one that goes from you to God is you are supposed to be mindful of God. That is, that he is in your sights. You're aware of him, that he's in your suffering. And then his arrow to you is that you are in his sights. You are seen. We'll get to this more tomorrow. And he's pleased to watch you be with him in this regard. So number 7, suffering can do something for me. It can actually benefit for me. And what is that? Suffering, number 8. Suffering is an invitation. Suffering invites us. Suffering invites us if we invite God to our suffering. So a suffering event is an invitation for you to invite God to your suffering event. So suffering is an invitation for us to invite God to our suffering. So listen to this podcast if you suffering. There's a wisdom to sharing your suffering with other people. There's a brotherhood, there's a holy nation, but that's not what this passage is about. This passage is about sharing your suffering with God, putting God into your suffering. He wants to share himself with you in your suffering if we invite him. Now, I know many of you have a loss of a spouse, loss of a child, loss of your health, physical pain, relational pain, distress, anxiety, mental affliction, disappointment. What God is inviting us to do is to share our pain, our sting, our grief, share it with him. So we're going to ask today, what can suffering do for me? Well, it invites us to invite God, to be seen by God, to be exampled by Jesus here. We'll find out about that tomorrow, and be pleasing to him. So the prayer today, here it is. Lord, I invite you to my suffering. Thank you for listening, my suffering listeners.